All right, so for the next talk, we've got our very own Lizzie, who's an engineer at Figma, and Jenny, who's a designer at Figma, and they're going to give you a little sneak peek behind the scenes of how our team works together to build some of our products. So I'll let them take it away.
Okay. Okay, wait. Oh, it's on. It's on.
Testing.
Hello. Hi. Hello. How are you? There's like so many more of you than we thought there was going to be, so hopefully this is good. It's good. But yeah, I think some of you, most of you, probably are familiar with a diagram that looks like this, right? Yeah. It's not advancing.
The pause wasn't meant to be that long. It's not going forward.
It's going to be really dramatic now. It advanced. Okay, great. Well, if you're not familiar with it, it's the double diamond design process. It's something often in design school that we talk about as like a way to, at the beginning, you're sort of like converging and diverging to decide like what the problem is that you're going to solve. And then doing the same like converging and diverging on different ideas to figure out what the actual thing you're going to build is. So since we are, I am a designer at Figma, working on a design tool for designers, we're all about the design process that is like the holy and sacred design process. It's the design process. So we're going to tell you about how we use it at Figma. I'm kidding. I'm totally kidding. I'm kidding. It actually doesn't really look anything like this ever at Figma.
Hi, I'm Lizzie. I'm an engineer at Figma.
And I'm Jenny, a designer at Figma. So even though we both work at a company that very much cares about both design and engineering, like pretty equally, we don't really ever get the time to sort of like do the perfect process. And it's actually very messy for both of us. So our talk is endearingly called A Beautiful Mess, how we build things at Figma. And we're here to sort of peel back the design tool curtain a little bit and share with you some of the process and the messiness around two of our biggest launches from last year.
And we're going to embrace the mess in our speech too, and not just because we're using Jessica as our clicker, but also because when we originally had a speech written out, but when we ran through it on Tuesday, it felt really, really bad.
It's 2 days ago.
That's 2 days ago.
Really stressful.
We were telling you guys to embrace the mess, but our speech itself was memorized, it was bullet pointed, it was down to the second. So we threw it all away, and we're doing a brand new format, brand new speech, so bear with us.
Yeah, so it's going to be a little bit of a two-person Q&A and sort of like a fireside chat between us, even though there's no fire.
And it's pretty warm in here.
Yeah, it is warm. It's warmer than it was. And we're just going to share the different design and engineering viewpoints around these two projects that hopefully you'll appreciate.
Yeah, and the first Q&A is with Jenny, who worked on Community, which is a launch you probably have heard a lot about at Config. So Jenny, will you tell us a little bit about what Community is for the people that missed it?
Sure. I love this dynamic, it's great. Cool, so Community, if you haven't heard of it, it was this launch last October that was pretty big and dramatic. And it basically gave people the ability to build their own profiles for the first time and actually publish things and put them on their profiles. So that way, basically anybody in the world could actually see those files and then therefore duplicate those files and start and build upon them and remix them. And that way, if you're a designer just starting out, you no longer need to start with a blank canvas. You can actually, just start from somebody else's work. Next slide. So since Jason didn't get his slide up, this is a shout out to you. And we actually put this slide in there before we knew you were talking before us. But it is seriously one of the most exciting things in our Figma community right now, where the city of Chicago has their design system on Figma. And for me personally, these are three of my favorite things coming together, right? It's cities, design systems, and Figma all in one place. So yeah, and they actually use this system out in the wild in some of their chicago.gov websites. But since it's on the Figma community, that also means that you can therefore go and use it yourself too.
Cool. So this
oh, back one. Sorry.
Oh.
Yes. And to go alongside with that, in that October launch, we also decided to redesign the entire Figma file browser.
Just for fun.
Just because we could. So yeah, that was, you could say it was a pretty big and exciting launch.
So this was one of our biggest launches from last year. How long did it take?
Go to the next slide. So to be honest, like the process felt a little bit like this, and it actually only took the course of 8 weeks.
For both design and eng?
For both design and engineering, basically. We started in August. The launch was in October. We knew we wanted to do something about like community in October, just because it's a thing that we've often talked about. Is like, how do we bring in not just you and your team to work together, but actually like the greater design community, like you guys, right? And it's like something we've always thought about, but like we just were like, okay, we're gonna do it in October, and it's August, and we're gonna get there somehow.
And how did you get there somehow?
I think you can go to the next slide. So there was just a lot of people on this project. So essentially there's like 2 different teams working on this project. So that means like 2 PMs, 2 designers, and then like the merge of like these 2 engineering teams working together. So it was just a lot of people working together in a short period of time. And I think that like we like deadlines at Figma. We have them because they sort of like unite people together in this like common cause, like common timeline. But this was definitely like a very fast one. Like 8 weeks is fast for us, and we all like really, really felt it, I think.
Just to give you guys an example of what it means when she says we really felt it, I can give you kind of some anecdotes from the engineering team at the end of the launch. This was a shit show towards the end of the launch, honestly. There were like 3 deploys a day. People were working like down to the wire. I saw engineers coding in an Uber. In an Uber.
Not even
how did it get to that state? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, I think even though originally we had started this project and we like scoped it down to a few pages, like we knew we wanted to make a profile. We also wanted to make a way for people to publish, but we also just like sort of, as we were like building those things, we realized like, hey, like we need to make all these pages and we just have like nowhere to put them. I think if you go to the next slide, there is this. Yeah, actually, just leave it there. Like basically, we made all these pages that are like in this file, and we had nowhere to put them, so we actually had to like redesign a lot of like the sidebar and the information architecture of Figma completely, and take this sort of like holistic view before we like put the pieces back together. And that actually took a long time because it's like you want to be careful and like deliberate about those decisions, but then at the same time you like start building these like decisions and you're like, oh wait, that's not the best way to do it. You sort of have to backtrack, and there's like a little bit of that thrash that I think was like really hard for our engineers.
Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about the thrash more, because there was a period of like deep confusion for engineering when the design changed a lot, and
yeah,
for an engineer that like is really, really painful. But I'd love to hear it from the design point of view as well.
Yeah, so I think like a good example of this is like, so there were 2 designers working on this, like Rasmus, the other designer, and I, and we had actually like split out our parts like pretty cleanly. So we were both working on different features, and as a result, we were like just exploring those different features in different files. And then that was really confusing because like the timeline snuck up on us, and engineers were ready to build, and we, for the most part, had things separate, but there were parts that were overlapping that like weren't the same. So like what I'm showing you actually is like the final file that we used when we were like, hey, we're gonna actually combine all these, like all of our work into one file, and make sure that like only the top like page is actually the finished, like the ready to implement stuff. And then that way it was like easier to sort of navigate and like know what to build. So like literally like every page in Figma is like in this file, and it's gigantic.
How long does it take to load this file, out of curiosity?
We definitely like duplicated and like deleted a bunch of stuff like multiple times, but it was like, yeah, there's also like 10 engineers in this file at every time. And then if you go to the next slide, like some of the sort of discrepancies between our files were like, this was one exploration of the profile, and then if you go to the next one, this is another exploration. They're like functionally the same, but actually like very different. And like those were in our 2 different files, and engineers were just like, what? Like, what do I build?
Yeah, because like functionally they are similar, but in code this is completely different. Like you can't even reuse components between the 2, I would imagine.
Yeah. So I think that was like really frustrating, and I think if we maybe had more time, I think we probably would have neatened that up a little bit. Yeah.
Which kind of brings me to my next question, because Community has pretty much launched now for at least everyone in this room. Given what you know now, what would you change in the past?
Yeah, so I think like we ended up spending a lot of time like just sort of redesigning the file browser just because there was like so many parts that we had to like shove into there. I think if you go to the next slide, like we had to add all these new profiles, and then next slide. We like thought about all these different pages that we had to like cram in there, and even though it sort of like doesn't look that different, go to the next slide. It like doesn't look that different, but it like took like a stepping back and that time to like rethink about how these things fit together. That ended up taking away time, I think, from like actually focusing on some of the stuff that was like more exciting to you guys when we launched. Like the most exciting stuff was really the community stuff. It wasn't like how neat this like file browser is. So I think in hindsight, we maybe would have like focused and like built features like searching and browsing, like
which we can do now.
Yes, we can do now. But like before, when this launched to our like exclusive beta group, you could go to figma.com and like you would know that there's like somebody's profile and somebody's published files, but there's like no way to get there, like unless someone sent you a direct link to them. It just like the pieces just didn't fit totally together, and I think in hindsight we might have done that, but that was sort of hard to see without actually starting to design it and starting to build it and starting to get that feedback from you guys.
Yeah, and honestly, like even if you had spent more time in total on the project, it's like unclear if that would have been better for Figma as a whole, because we launched a ton of things last year.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, this project, if we like really wanted to, you know, first do like a lot of user research and then like do more explorations and then like spend all this time exploring and like prototyping and like getting feedback before we launched, we actually probably could have spent like all year on this. Yeah.
But then we would have missed out on everything else that we launched that year.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, and I think for us, since this was like really new and like kind of high risk, we just like wanted to do it quickly and like get it out there for you guys.
Which you did.
Yeah. Cool. So we're gonna switch gears a little bit.
We didn't work on transitions.
Yeah, we're bad at transitions. Sorry. So Lizzie also worked on a project last year that was like pretty exciting, and it was scrappy in a different way, but also like, you know, it was like a brand new thing for us. So I want to dive a little bit more into that.
Thank you, Jessica. So yeah, last year we launched Design System Analytics around November, and this is a product for organizations. And in case you missed it, I'll give you guys a quick explanation. Bear with me. So this is basically to give you insight into how healthy your design system is. And so basically it exposes metrics about how your components are used, where they're being used, and like whether they're inserted or detached, and how this changed over time. This is meant for design system users, so they can see the impact of their libraries, and they know that when they're publishing a new change, whether or not this would make a huge impact or not.
Yeah, so I think like we internally heard this was really exciting. So it seems like we got great feedback from you. But I think I really like to learn about like what was hard or like what went wrong. So tell us more about what was like difficult about this.
Yeah, so this project was really hard because there was absolutely nothing for us to build on. Before we finished this project, there was no metric gathering or like aggregating or storage system for any of this type of stuff at all. Usually when you start building like a design doc or like a product spec, you at least know the limits of your system. But if you don't have a system, you have no limits. And so we all really got stuck like very early in the beginning.
Okay, so it seems like you had no metrics, no constraints, and just like this was like a totally new idea.
It was basically just one big question mark.
Okay, so tell me more about like being stuck and like what that really meant to you guys.
So I'll give you guys a little bit like concrete examples to kind of drive it home. So Clancy needed to do user research, but he had nothing to show in those user research sessions. There was absolutely no data at all. Tom, our designer, needed to make a design spec, but had no idea what metrics he needed to show. Like, how do you visualize data if you have no idea what the data is going to look like? And my team and I had to build like a brand new system, but we didn't know like what do we have to build without a design spec or a product spec. We have like absolutely no idea. So we got really, really stuck.
Yeah, and I think I want to point out that this is like a pretty like particular example of like this sort of ambiguity at Figma, because it's like usually like you have a product spec or you have engineering constraints, but it sounds like your roles were sort of like tightly coupled here, which is particular. But like what is probably not like really particular about this project is that you were sort of in this ambiguous like phase, which I think like we've all worked on projects where it just like gets very ambiguous and it's kind of like greenfield. So I think we can all learn a little bit more about like how did you get out of that ambiguous period?
Yeah, so it like took we had to kind of like give up the idea like of of making a complete product straight from the beginning. And for an engineer, this is like actually extremely, extremely scary, because if you're like designing something new or like building something new and you don't know the design doc or you don't know the product spec, you could be building something that is going to be thrown away. And that, like, for me is like really, it feels really bad. And I know it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back is still forward motion, but it like still feels really, really bad. But we had to approach it because like we had to get moving, right?
Yeah, and I think like diving into that like 1 step forward, 2 step backwards like sort of idea. I think this is often a point of contention between designers and engineers, where like as a designer, I'm like, I'm gonna make like 40 explorations and like spend all this time on these 40 explorations, and I like know that when I'm doing those 40 explorations, only one of them's getting built. And then obviously you're gonna throw the other ones away because you can't build 40 solutions, right? But then like when I do that and like maybe the design changes and then I tell an engineer and I'm like, oh yeah, the thing that we built, we tried it out and it doesn't work, so let's like build this other thing. They're always like, like they're like, oh my god, like you can't just like throw away code,
That's
right?
much the noise we make, yeah.
But then I'm like, oh, I just did that same, like I threw away my work too. Like, what's the problem? So like, can you give us a little bit more perspective into like what that means for you as an engineer?
Yeah, so I think about this a lot because that noise you made is like exactly how I feel when it happens. But yeah, so like I have an analogy for it, and like if I'm wrong, please like let me know. Like for design, when you're throwing something away, it kind of feels like you're ripping something out of a notebook, right? Your notebook still stays whole, and you're able to cleanly rip those pages out. But as an engineer, it feels like you're knitting a scarf. So like as you're knitting, you're building like new stitches, and you're building things upon the like new stitches that you just built. So it's not as easy to like go through and just rip out a page. You have to unravel what was already built on top of it and kind of like surgically remove what you did. I think a more common example is like a brick wall. You're taking things out the bottom, but
yeah.
Scarves are softer.
Yeah. No, I really like that analogy, and I think that it helped me. Like when I first heard you say that, I was like, oh yeah.
Duh.
Duh. Okay. Yeah. Sure. Cool. So yeah, like tell me a little bit more about how you did some of that, like scrappy, like building something and then throwing it away in this process.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to show you one of the first versions of design system analytics that we like created. So this is actually a third-party app called Mode, which is used to display metrics. And this is what we showed to people during our user research sessions. Clancy showed this to them, and it's pretty messy. And also, what you don't see is that the metric system that creates these metrics at this point was a mess. It was not reactive. It took almost 7 to 8 hours to run. It was super slow. It was super clunky. It was super jank. And basically, before every single user research session, the night before, we would run the code specifically for the people inside that user session. And so like they can get this filled out, and Clancy could show them out-of-date, possibly wrong data during the data research sessions. But it worked. With this data, with this visualization, we were able to get a lot of super useful feedback about like what data was just noise, what was super useful, and we were able to like move forward. We did have to throw a lot of the system we originally wrote away, but it got us past the original part of being stuck.
Yeah, and I think this is an interesting example of like prototyping actually, because I think like that's not really the word that we use to describe this, but this was a prototype. And like I think when we talk about prototyping, we like imagine as a designer, you're like, oh yeah, like this like fluid animation where this like checkbox like turns into a bus and like it's like beautiful and animated, right? That's like I think I've legitimately seen that before. But like this is a prototype too, and it like was very valuable, and like it got you to like a destination where you felt like more confident, and like that should be the role of a prototype often, right? So
and the color scheme ain't bad actually. Yeah. Mode did a good job on.
It's kind of on brand. I don't know. But yeah, I think another thing that you mentioned was that like you worked with Clancy doing user research, which I think like for me at Figma, I know that Clancy is our data scientist at Figma, so he works more on the quantitative side, but he was doing much more of a qualitative research job here. And then Tom, the designer on this, actually is more on the sales side, even though he has a design background. So it seemed like everyone was sort of like blending and like trying out new roles. How did that feel like working together like that?
Yeah, so I can't speak for Clancy or Tom, but I can kind of give you my experience with it. So this was also one of my first forays into working with a designer, because I'm actually an infrastructure engineer. I build like systems. I very rarely touch the front end, but because we had to build something brand new, we needed an infrastructure engineer on it. And so it was really cool to start working with Tom, because something very unique that Tom did is that he showed us all the in-between stages, all the good, the bad, the ugly. They're mostly good. Like he's a great designer. But if you flip through the next 3 slides, and one more, yeah. Those were the iterations that Tom showed us, plus many, many more. Like the first one actually is like pretty rough, but you see it like develop. And that was actually the most useful thing that like got us through a lot of these communication barriers for me.
And I heard that Tom actually didn't want you to see some of these explorations.
He did not want us to see the first one. We actually found it. So we were like doing the preliminary discussion, and like we were digging through a Figma file, and we accidentally dug up that first design. And he was a little reluctant to show us, but it was extremely useful in pushing the conversation forwards.
Okay, let's go back and like put that on the screen, just because Tom doesn't want us to look at it. Hi, Tom.
I actually think it's gorgeous. It's minimal.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting that Tom didn't want you to see this, even though this was useful. And like I think for me personally as a designer, like if you're any designer who like cares about like working with people, you're always like, share early, share often. Like, you know, you just say it to yourself every day in the morning. And you know it.
Are you okay, Jenny?
Okay. But like, it's hard still, you know? Like if there's still stuff, like when you share early and you share often, you still like emotionally prepare yourself, or you like sort of stage your work a little bit where you like get rid of the messy stuff so people can consume it. And like, I think for this specifically, like, I don't know, like like all the comments that Tom got and stuff like that. I think those are always really interesting and like really helpful in the process, but they can actually be like hard for a designer, even though you know that it's appropriate. Like I think there's sometimes where you're just like sharing something and then you get like questions that are like, oh, like why did you do this? Or like this can't work, and it can feel very like, oh, like wait, like I haven't resolved this yet, and like you sort of feel like a little bit intimidated, or like it can feel like a very scary part of the process, even though you know and like rationally know it's like supposed to be normal and good, right?
Yeah, I've heard that like sharing with engineers in particular is like even harder to like share early. And is there something that we can do to like make this a little less terrifying? Because I am very empathetic to this feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all know it's good and normal. It's sometimes you just get hard questions like, have you thought about this state? And you're just like, I haven't, like, you know, like, I haven't. But like, I think an important part about like this process is just sort of like giving each other feedback and like doing that in a way that's productive. And a big part of like becoming and like learning how to be a designer is actually learning how to give each other feedback, right? So like, instead of things being like, oh, like, why did you do this? Or like, oh, I don't think this is gonna work. Designers often do things like, they frame things like, I wonder if you tried this, or like phrasing things as open questions, like, have you tried explorations like this? Or like, how have you considered like what this is gonna do to the data, right? Like things that sort of empower and put trust in the designer, as opposed to sort of like, kind of like interrogating them, right?
Yeah, so like putting the trust in the designer thing is actually really interesting too, because engineers have design docs too. In these design docs, we like explore solutions to the problem. And in every single design doc, honestly, the only important part is the alternatives considered section, because it gives people like trust that you have considered all other options and that out of them you have picked the right one. And I think that like being able to see like the early works of a designer like is the equivalent of seeing the alternatives considered section of an engineer design doc. And so I know it's really scary, and we can certainly work on our tone, but I why didn't you do that, Jenny? I hate it. I'm so sorry. But like we can certainly work on our tone, and we should. But I think that like being a little vulnerable is like could help us as well.
Yeah, and I think I've been a part of those like technical like docs once in a while, but I think I like even when you mentioned it, like I like forgot that I didn't realize that like engineers go through this process too.
We're not so different.
Anyway, like Yeah, I mean, I think like this, it just sort of shows like this sort of like messy tension that has to go on in every project, and it sort of feels necessary, but can be hard, which is like part of what makes it messy, right? So anyway, I want to sort of go back to like this project. Like we know it was like really messy, but let's talk a little bit more about like what happened when it launched.
Shoot it forward 4.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So this is actually the Twitter page from when Design System Analytics launched. So it launched on November 20th, and I spent pretty much the entire day refreshing this page. And it, like after the initial being stuck period, everything else went very smoothly because we took so long resolving the stuck feeling in the beginning. We had to work so closely together, ironing out kinks super early that the rest of it like went super smoothly. And I was really happy at the end, obviously.
Nice. So it's like you bonded over your messiness.
Yes.
Yes.
Cute.
Yes, very cute.
So yeah, that actually concludes our talk, our Q&A, our like fireside chat without a fireside. We shared with you 2 stories, and they're from 2 different projects, but we think that the common theme through them is that like messiness is not unusual. In fact, it's probably present in every single project that you guys have worked on as well.
And if there's one thing that we want you to take away from this, it's that like you should feel okay about that messiness, and that's like not the part that you should be stressed out about. It's, if anything, like it will always be a little bit messy, and I think at Figma we know that, and we just try to embrace it, and we just like deal with it. So thank you for coming. We hope you stay messy.